terror organizations by Paul Brandenburg. It was almost a year ago. That's when 3 special units of the Berlin police force stormed 3 apartments in combat gear. My brother's, my mother's, and my own. Just on the day of the Constitution, May 23rd, 2022. They were there on an alleged mission against me as a felon who is said to possess weapons of war. With these, the officers said, I would allegedly train terrorists. I would organize shooting trainings for right-wing radicals and other delegitimizers of the ruling regime. There must have been over 50 officers who spent the entire day searching these 3 apartments and their basements, as well as an office in the faraway town of Leipzig. The policemen left behind destroyed doors and furniture. They stole telephones and computers and my brother's and my own firearms, all of which were legal. They insulted, abused, and mistreated 2 women over the age of 70 and my brother and myself. The damage caused by the terror units on that day sums up to over 20,000 euros. They forced me to take a mugshot, to undergo identification service treatment, with the taking of fingerprints, photos, and measurement of shoe size, among others. The taking of a genetic sample, so they told me, they were only allowed to offer to me, without physical coercion, which is also what the law wants. Why these special police officers still adhere to this law of all things remains their secret. The genetic sample, in any case, was for some unknown reason one of the things that was not taken from me on that day against all law. The outcome of this special operation, the findings of evidence, traces, and the sum of possibly prevented crimes is a grand total of 0. They found no weapons of war and no other illegal firearms. They found no networks, no dubious contacts, or even the slightest evidence of shooting trainings or other preparations for all the things that the conspiracy theorists in the Berlin Secret Police Office must have spun up. To this day, they nevertheless search my confiscated phones and computers and refuse to hand them over to me, as well as my brother's and my own weapons. According to several informants from within the regime's apparatus, not only the search of the devices stolen from me continues. According to these informants, both the Staatsschutz, the secret police of the Berlin Police Office, and the so-called Verfassungsschutz, the domestic intelligence office, are shadowing and eavesdropping on me around the clock. Members of the Berlin State Parliament were informed by the Secret Service that Paul Brandenburg was the head of a network of enemies of the state and one of the most dangerous threats to the state. Evidence for this claim would not yet be available, but that was only a question of time. An official report about this was never published, for it is supposed to be confidential. My formal request for information invoking data protection and personal rights law was temporarily rejected, and I was informed it would take at least another 8 months until the Secret Service would be able to tell me what data exactly they had stored about me. The reason for this delay was work overload. They thanked me for my understanding. Not only the Secret Service, but also the public prosecutors and their other terrorist aides are empty-handed and disgraced to the bone. The identification service treatment by the police was of such blatant illegality that already the authorities' own objection office had to order the deletion of all forced data and admit that the breach of law was evident. Even more, the public prosecutor, Mr. Robert Kohli, who was responsible for this terrorist act, could not hide the fact that the alleged war weapons violation were based on no other findings than an anonymous revenge letter of a frustrated ex-employee of my company. He fabricated it in such a clumsy simplicity, with absurdities that even Mr. Kohli could not deny at a cursory glance who and for what reason this was obviously fabricated and spread. The fabrication was so evident that Prosecutor Kohli could not avoid taking up investigations on his own initiative against this ex-employee. Had he not done this, the intention of the prosecutor's office would have become all too obvious. Why Mr. Kohli, though, ignored all the obviousness of the false accusations until after his terrorist operation remains a question he hardly wants to answer publicly. One may assume that the Attorney General's office lacks any motivation to make an indictment against me for this reason alone. Any attempt at an indictment would be obscene anyway, and immediate termination of these investigations would be long warranted. But then, of course, the acts of the state terrorists would become official. They therefore keep delaying the whole process by all means. And if they have one inexhaustible resource while doing so, it is unscrupulousness and stupidity. For the measurement of the latter, the name of one man above all others suggests itself. That of Detective Inspector Walbach. This Mr. Walbach is currently posing as the Volkssturm, as the last posse of his masters whose backs could not be closer to the wall. Like his predecessor in the office of my personal detective, Mr. Walbach belongs to the department of the so-called Staatsschutz of the Berlin State Criminal Police Office. His predecessor, Detective Watzek, was a policeman who constructed a 27-page-long paper to prove me guilty of a right-wing extremism crime. This had allegedly consisted in the fact that I illustrated my text New Normal Reich with an eagle and a heart. Detective Watzek finally received the said 27 pages back from his public prosecutor by return of post, supplemented by yet another page. On it, the public prosecutor noted in the brief 3-line sentence that nothing relevant was to be recognized in all that had been presented by the detective. It may be due to achievements like these that Detective Watzek was replaced by Detective Walbach, whom I propose as the eponym of a new scale. Detective Walbach seems to be aiming at surpassing his predecessor in simplicity. Walbach is the initiator and the only witness of a new accusation that is now being constructed against me by the very prosecutor who sent Walbach's predecessor home so harshly, a gentleman by the very German name of Zum Kolk. Detective Walbach presented this public prosecutor with a new collection of evidence, which he begins with exactly the matter presented by his predecessor, which had been rejected before by Mr. Zum Kolk. And Detective Walbach does not spare himself to close his collection of evidence with an open admission of the actual motives of the acting terror authorities. Quote, "The executive measures based on the suspicion of violating the War Weapons Control Act have not contributed to a de-radicalization and a norm-compliant way of life of Mr. Brandenburg. It is rather the opposite that is the case, and Mr. Brandenburg is celebrated as a martyr within the scene with his report on the measures and was able to increase his reach." End quote. The scale for measuring police stupidity could not bear a more appropriate name than that of Kriminalkommissar Walbach. And as it seems now, Detective Walbach will soon have to present himself to the interested public. The reason being that his accomplice, Prosecutor Zum Kolk, had obtained a penalty order over 3,000 euros against me in the mentioned matter, which I, of course, have objected against. According to the mechanics of German criminal law, it will now come, with some probability, to an oral hearing of the court. Detective Walbach will probably have to appear as a witness, and Mr. Zum Kolk will have to justify the latest maneuvers of his office. I will, of course, make a possible date public in advance. Why would a public prosecutor steer into almost certain defeat in such a way? Why does he allow an imbecile to compile evidence for him, which he himself had already rejected as unsuitable? Only one explanation comes to mind: desperation. Desperation in the face of the imminent embarrassment of all the terror aides involved in the matter of their special mission on the day of the Constitution. And as they say, in court and on high seas, one is in God's hands. The public prosecutor's office may be pinning all its hopes on being able to divert attention from its inevitable disgrace by achieving a conviction in some other minor matter. After all it needs is some judge who, in some matter of some day, does not look so closely and sentences this enemy of the state, at least in a first instance. Then they would at least have a day to close their war weapons investigation in a comparatively silent way. This is why I expect more and more absurd accusations against me by the public prosecutors and their henchmen of the new normal Reich. All its terror helpers and the secret services, the police and the court, however, I assure, I will publish all files as well as all the names of all perpetrators. These names and these files are neither on my computer or telephone, nor in any other way in my apartment or in my possession. However, they are safe with a large number of people who guarantee that everything will be made public. It will be made public immediately in the case of my disappearance, be it because of detention or any other surprising event.